Every woman in England knew one simple rule: never embarrass a duke. Clara Ashford had a different rule: never let a duke embarrass you twice. She had walked through that iron gate with nothing but a worn leather bag, a letter of introduction no one had bothered to read, and a secret that could have brought the entire Wrentham estate to its knees. She chose not to use it, not yet. But the Duke didn't know that. The Duke didn't know anything about her, or so he believed. That was his first mistake. The carriage that brought Clara to Wrentham Manor belonged to a neighbor's coachman who had taken pity on her at the crossroads. She had not asked for a ride. She had simply been walking, spine straight, chin level, as though the mud on her boots was entirely beneath her notice, which, to be fair, it was. The manor rose from the morning mist like something out of a Gothic warning. 3 stories of gray stone, ivy-strangled window frames and chimneys that exhaled thin white smoke into a sky the color of old pewter. It was not a welcoming house. It was not meant to be. The housekeeper, Mrs. Baird, met her at the servants' entrance, not the front door, a fact that Clara noted and filed away without expression. Miss Ashford. Mrs. Baird looked her over the way one examines a piece of furniture that has arrived slightly damaged. You're the new governess. I am. His Grace does not involve himself in the hiring of staff. You will meet the children at 7. Breakfast is at 6:30 in the kitchen with the rest of the household. Clara nodded once. And my room. The room was in the east wing, small and cold, with a window that overlooked the stables. The fireplace had not been lit. There were no candles on the writing table. The previous governess, Clara would later learn, had left without notice 3 weeks prior, and no one had thought to prepare for a replacement. She lit the fire herself. She unpacked her single bag with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped expecting comfort and started creating it. A hairbrush, 2 changes of dress, a small book of botanical illustrations her mother had given her, the only thing left from a life that no longer existed. She did not allow herself to think about that life for more than 30 seconds. Then she went to meet the children. Thomas was 9, serious-faced, and deeply suspicious of adults who smiled too quickly. Annabel was 6, gap-toothed, and had apparently been terrorizing governesses since she learned to speak in full sentences. They were sitting at the schoolroom table when Clara arrived, both watching the door with the particular wariness of children who had been disappointed many times before. "You won't last a month," Thomas said, by way of introduction. "Probably not," Clara agreed, sitting across from them without ceremony. "But you'll learn something before I go. Now, which of you is better at geography?" Thomas blinked. Annabel raised her hand. It was, Clara would think later, the only easy moment of that first day. She saw the Duke for the first time at 4:30 in the afternoon. She was crossing the main corridor with a stack of atlases when he came through the front door, still in his riding coat, mud-splattered and clearly in no mood for the world. He was taller than she had expected. Darker, too, black hair, sharp jaw, the kind of face that looked as though it had forgotten how to arrange itself into anything warmer than impatience. He did not look at her. He handed his gloves to the footman, said something low to his steward, and walked past her as though she were part of the wallpaper. Clara watched him go. Then she looked down at the atlases in her arms, and at the mud his boots had tracked across the floor she was standing on. On the corner of the corridor table, half tucked beneath a silver letter tray, was a document she should not have been able to see from that distance. But Clara had always had sharp eyes. The wax seal was broken. The letterhead, even upside down, even at 5 paces, was unmistakable. It was her father's crest. Her hands tightened on the atlases. Her face did not change. She turned and walked back to the schoolroom. What was her father's seal doing on the Duke's correspondence? And why did it look like it had been read more than once? Clara Ashford had come to Wrentham Manor to disappear. She was beginning to suspect that Wrentham Manor had been waiting for her all along. It started with a map. Clara had spent 3 days quietly establishing order in the schoolroom, a routine, a rhythm, a sense that learning could be something other than punishment. Thomas had stopped watching the door. Annabel had started asking questions before Clara finished her sentences, small victories but real ones. On the 4th morning, she unrolled a map of the British Empire across the schoolroom table and asked the children to find India. Thomas pointed correctly, immediately. Annabel said, "Is that where pepper comes from?" Clara said yes, and added that it was also where fortunes were made and lost, where the East India Company had rewritten the rules of trade, and where, at that very moment, thousands of people were living lives entirely different from anything the children could imagine from this gray corner of England. She did not hear the door open. "That is not the approved curriculum." The Duke's voice came from behind her, flat and certain, the voice of a man who had never once second-guessed himself in a room and did not intend to start now. Clara turned. He was standing in the doorway, no riding coat this time, just a dark morning coat, impeccably fitted, with the kind of posture that made the door frame look like a picture frame built specifically for him. He was looking at the map the way one looks at evidence of wrongdoing. "Your Grace," Clara did not step back from the table. The children were covering trade routes. The map seemed relevant. "The curriculum was written for a reason, Miss Ashford. History, mathematics, French, in that order. Thomas can already conjugate in French. Annabel has memorized the kings and queens of England to a degree that I suspect would alarm most adults. They were ready to move forward." Something shifted in his expression, not softness, not quite, more like surprise that had been quickly suppressed. "I was not consulted." "Governesses rarely consult dukes, Your Grace. That is rather the arrangement." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and temperature. Thomas had gone very still. Annabel was looking between the two adults with the bright, dangerous attention of a child who understands more than she should. The Duke stepped into the room. He looked at the map. He looked at Clara. "Wellington's campaign," he said. "Which year did he enter the Indian subcontinent?" It was a test. Clara recognized it immediately, the particular tone of a man who expects to catch someone out. "Wellington himself did not enter India," Clara said calmly. "You are perhaps thinking of his brother Richard, who served as Governor-General. Arthur Wellesley fought in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War in 1799. If you are testing my knowledge of the period, Your Grace, I would suggest we have that conversation somewhere the children are not using it as entertainment." Annabel covered her mouth. Thomas looked at the ceiling. The Duke's jaw tightened. "You are dismissed for the day, Miss Ashford." Clara looked at him steadily. "It is 10 o'clock in the morning." "Then you have a great deal of afternoon ahead of you." He moved to the door and held it open, not as a courtesy but as a conclusion. "Mrs. Baird will settle your wages for the week. I trust you can find your way to the village from here." The first drop of rain hit the window 30 seconds after Clara walked out of the schoolroom. By the time she had retrieved her bag from the east wing, she had not unpacked much, a habit of the careful. The sky had turned the specific shade of greenish-gray that meant the kind of rain that does not apologize. She stood at the servants' entrance and looked at the road. 3 miles to the village. No carriage had been offered. She had not asked for one because she already knew the answer. Mrs. Baird appeared behind her, looking genuinely uncomfortable for the first time since Clara had arrived. "Miss Ashford, I could ask." "No need," Clara said. The road floods past the old mill. If you go through Fenwick's field and then cut along. Thank you, Mrs. Baird. She walked out into the rain. The Duke left for the village at 10:30. He told himself it was business. There was a matter at the solicitor's office that had been waiting, and the rain, though inconvenient, was not enough to delay it. He told himself he was not thinking about the governess on the road. He had dismissed staff before. It was not a complicated act. He did not look toward the road as he rode out. He looked once. The road was empty. Good, he thought, and rode faster. The village of Wrentham was 12 minutes by horse on a dry day. In the rain, on a road that had begun to pool in the low places, it was closer to 20. The Duke arrived at the solicitor's office, handed his horse to the boy at the post, and pushed open the door of the Crown and Anchor across the street first, because the solicitor kept poor hours and poorer tea. The inn was warm and smelled of wood smoke and bread. And there at the small table nearest the fire sat Clara Ashford. Dry. Her hair was neat. Her back was straight. She had a cup of tea in front of her and a book open beside it, and she was reading with the complete composure of someone who had been sitting there for quite some time. The Duke stopped in the doorway. Clara looked up. Her expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes, the very faintest suggestion of satisfaction, there and gone in less than a second. "Your Grace," she said pleasantly, "did you have a difficult ride?" He stood in the doorway of the Crown and Anchor, rain dripping from his coat onto the flagstone floor, and stared at a woman who had left his estate on foot, in a downpour, 3 miles from the village, 20 minutes before him. And arrived first. "How?" he said, and stopped. Clara turned a page of her book. "The tea here is quite good," she said. "I recommend it." The Duke of Wrentham had faced down creditors, Parliament, and a Napoleonic skirmish outside Brussels without losing his composure. He had met his match in a governess with a worn leather bag and no carriage. The question was, did he know it yet? The Duke ordered nothing. He stood at the entrance of the Crown and Anchor for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to establish in his own mind that he was not flustered, that the situation was entirely ordinary, and that a governess sitting dry and composed in a village inn after a 3-mile walk through a rainstorm was not, in any meaningful sense, his concern. Then he sat down at the table across from her. He was not entirely sure why. "The solicitor keeps poor hours," he said, by way of explanation to no one in particular. Said Clara, turning another page. The innkeeper's wife appeared. The Duke ordered tea without looking up from the middle distance, where he was busy not thinking about the question that was eating a very neat hole through his composure. 3 miles, rain, no carriage, 20 minutes. "Miss Ashford." "Your Grace." "How did you get here?" It was not quite a question. It came out flat, the way his sentences did when he was working very hard to sound as though something did not matter to him. Clara looked up from her book. She considered him for a moment, not nervously, not with deference, but with the calm attention of someone deciding how much to give away. "I found a way," she said. "I always do." "That is not an answer." "No," she agreed pleasantly, "it isn't." His tea arrived. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her with the expression of a man who was accustomed to receiving complete information and found its absence genuinely offensive. "There is no shortcut to the village from the manor. I know this road." "There is no shortcut on the road," Clara said. "I didn't use the road." He waited. She closed her book, folded her hands on top of it, and looked at him with something that was almost not quite, but almost amusement. "Mrs. Baird mentioned Fenwick's field. I crossed it, followed the drainage ditch to the old mill, and from there it is less than half a mile along the river path. Dry ground mostly under the tree line. She paused. Your coachman would know the route, I think, if you ever asked him. The Duke said nothing. I grew up in the country, Your Grace. I know how to read land. There was a silence. Outside, the rain pressed itself against the windows with renewed enthusiasm. You grew up in the country, he repeated, in the tone of a man cataloging information he had not expected to need. I did. Where? The briefest pause, so brief that a less observant man would have missed it entirely. Shropshire, she said. It rains there too. He rode back to the manor an hour later. He told himself the decision was already forming before he walked back through the front door. He told himself it was entirely about the children, who had, according to Mrs. Baird's uncomfortable report, refused their lunch and sat in the schoolroom in stubborn, unified silence for the better part of the morning. Thomas had apparently said, to anyone who would listen, that Annabel would cry herself sick by nightfall. Annabel had apparently said, to anyone who would listen, that she was not going to cry. She was simply not going to speak ever again to anyone in this house. The Duke stood in the corridor outside the schoolroom and listened to the silence coming from behind the door, and felt something in his chest that he would not have dignified with a name. He sent for Mrs. Baird. Send word to the village, he said. Ask Miss Ashford to return. Mrs. Baird's expression flickered with something that might have been relief, or might have been the specific satisfaction of a woman who has watched powerful men reverse themselves before, and finds it quietly gratifying every time. Of course, Your Grace. And have her room fire lit before she arrives. It was cold when she came. Mrs. Baird said nothing about the fact that she had mentioned this 3 days ago. She simply nodded and went. Clara arrived at 4 o'clock. She had not hurried. The Duke noted this from the upstairs window and chose not to examine why he had been standing at the upstairs window. She came through the front door this time, not the servants' entrance. He was not sure if that was Mrs. Baird's doing or her own. He suspected her own. He met her in the entrance hall. She stood with her bag at her feet and looked at him with an expression that gave him absolutely nothing to work with. Miss Ashford, he said, I would like you to return to your position. I see, said Clara. He waited for something more. Agreement, perhaps. Gratitude. The ordinary response of someone who has just been offered reinstatement after dismissal. Clara tilted her head very slightly. The curriculum, she said. He blinked. I beg your pardon.